What happens when one of Britain's most beloved comedic actors walks off a live morning show after a conversation takes an unexpected turn? The tension in the studio was palpable, and what started as a friendly chat about comedy and career milestones quickly spiraled into something nobody saw coming. Before we get into what happened, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about this whole situation. Now let's dive into how this interview went from light-hearted banter to a complete breakdown. The morning started like any other episode. Jenna welcomed viewers with her trademark enthusiasm, and her co-hosts were ready to chat with Rowan Atkinson, the legendary actor known for his incredible physical comedy and razor-sharp wit. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement, eager to hear stories from someone who had shaped comedy for generations. Jenna kicked things off with a warm greeting. "Welcome, welcome. It is such an honor to have you here. Honestly, we have been looking forward to this for weeks. Your work has brought so much joy to so many people." Rowan smiled politely, settling into his chair. "Thank you for having me. It is always nice to talk about the craft, though I must say I do hope we can have a proper conversation about comedy rather than the usual surface-level questions." The co-host Marcus jumped in with a laugh. "Oh, we definitely want to go deep. We want to know everything, the process, the inspiration, all of it." Rowan nodded. "Good. Because comedy is far more complex than people give it credit for. It is not just about making faces or falling over. There is a real intelligence to it, a precision." Jenna leaned forward. "Absolutely. And that is something we see in all your work. The physicality, the timing, it is like watching a master class every single time." For a few minutes, the conversation flowed smoothly. They discussed his approach to character development, how he builds a comedic persona from the ground up, and the importance of silence in comedy. Rowan seemed engaged, even enthusiastic, sharing insights that had the audience hanging on every word. Then Jenna shifted gears. "So we have to talk about how comedy has changed over the years. I mean, the landscape is so different now with social media and cancel culture and all of that. How do you navigate that as someone who has been in the industry for so long?" Rowan paused, his expression becoming more serious. "Well, that is quite a loaded question, is it not? The truth is, comedy has always pushed boundaries. That is its job. The problem now is that people seem to have forgotten that being offended is not the same as being harmed." Marcus interjected. "But don't you think comedians have a responsibility to be mindful of how their jokes might affect certain communities?" Rowan's tone sharpened slightly. "Mindful, yes. Censored, no. There is a difference between being thoughtful and being paralyzed by fear of offending someone. Comedy dies when you start policing every word, every gesture, every possible interpretation." Jenna nodded, but her co-host Simone spoke up. "I hear what you are saying, but surely you can understand why some people feel that certain types of humor perpetuate stereotypes or cause real harm, especially to marginalized groups." Rowan sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Here we go. This is exactly the problem. We are conflating jokes with actual prejudice. A joke is not a manifesto. It is not a policy. It is an exploration of human absurdity. When we start treating comedy like it is some kind of social engineering tool, we lose what makes it valuable in the first place." The atmosphere in the studio shifted. What had been a friendly discussion was now starting to feel like a debate. Jenna tried to steer things back. "I think what Simone is saying is that comedy can be powerful, and with that power comes some level of responsibility, right?" Rowan leaned forward. "Responsibility to whom? To the audience? Yes, I agree. My responsibility is to make them think, to make them laugh, to hold up a mirror to society. But my responsibility is not to make everyone comfortable. Comedy has never been about comfort." Marcus jumped back in. "But when you say hold up a mirror, whose perspective is that mirror reflecting? Because not everyone sees themselves in the comedy that gets made, especially historically." Rowan's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting that comedy should be some sort of equal opportunity employment scheme? That we should tick boxes to make sure every perspective is represented? Art does not work that way. Comedy does not work that way." Simone shook her head. "That is not what anyone is saying. We are just pointing out that the industry has been dominated by certain voices for a very long time, and maybe it is time to make space for others. Rowan's voice rose slightly. Make space? I have never stood in anyone's way. I have never stopped anyone from being funny. But I refuse to apologize for being successful or for creating work that resonates with millions of people. This idea that comedy needs to be democratized or diversified as if it is some kind of public utility is absurd. Jenna raised her hands in a calming gesture. Okay, I think we are all just trying to have an honest conversation here about how the industry is evolving. Rowan cut her off. Evolving or devolving? Because from where I sit, it looks like we are regressing into a world where everyone is terrified of saying the wrong thing, where creativity is strangled by committees of sensitivity readers and social media mobs. Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm. Social media mobs? That is a bit dramatic, don't you think? People are just asking for accountability. They are asking that comedians think about the impact of their words. Rowan let out a sharp laugh. Accountability? You mean submission? You mean bending the knee to whoever shouts the loudest online? That is not accountability. That is mob rule dressed up in progressive language. Simone's face flushed. That is incredibly dismissive of legitimate concerns that people have. When someone from a marginalized community says that a joke hurt them, that is not mob rule. That is lived experience. Rowan turned to face her directly. And when an artist says that a joke was meant to satirize, to provoke thought, to challenge assumptions, that is also lived experience. Why does one automatically trump the other? Why is the offended party always given moral authority while the creator is assumed to have malicious intent? Jenna tried again to redirect. I think what we are all dancing around is the question of intent versus impact. Can we agree that both matter? Rowan shook his head. Intent is everything. If we ignore intent, then we reduce all communication to how it makes people feel. And feelings are subjective. They are unreliable. They change with the wind. Comedy cannot survive in that environment. Marcus spoke up again. But impact is real. If a joke reinforces a harmful stereotype, the intent behind it does not erase the damage it might do. Rowan's voice grew colder. Damage? What damage? Show me the actual measurable damage caused by a joke. Not hurt feelings, not discomfort, but actual harm. You cannot, because jokes do not cause harm. Actions cause harm. Policies cause harm. Violence causes harm. Words, especially words meant in jest, do not. Simone shook her head vehemently. That is just not true. Words have power. Language shapes how we see the world, how we see each other. Jokes can normalize prejudice. They can make hateful ideas seem acceptable. Rowan sat up straighter. Or, and stay with me here, jokes can expose prejudice by mocking it. They can disarm hatred by making it look ridiculous. Satire has always been a weapon against tyranny, against stupidity, against pomposity. But now we are supposed to believe that jokes are the problem rather than the solution? Jenna interjected. Nobody is saying all jokes are the problem. We are talking about specific types of humor that punch down rather than punch up. Rowan groaned. Punch up, punch down, these are just meaningless buzzwords. Comedy punches in every direction. It has to. The moment you start creating protected classes that cannot be joked about, you create a hierarchy of who matters and who does not. That is the opposite of equality. Marcus raised his voice slightly. So you think there should be no limits at all? Anything goes? Rowan met his gaze. I think the limit is whether something is funny, not whether it is nice, not whether it is approved by some council of moral arbiters, but whether it makes people laugh. That is the only measure that matters in comedy. Simone looked incredulous. So if something makes people laugh, that automatically makes it okay? Even if it is racist, sexist, homophobic? Rowan exhaled sharply. You are deliberately conflating things. A joke that explores the absurdity of racism is not itself racist. A joke that mocks sexist attitudes is not itself sexist. But we have reached a point where people cannot or will not distinguish between the subject of a joke and the endorsement of that subject. Jenna tried to find middle ground. Can we at least agree that context matters? That there is a difference between a thoughtful satirical piece and just being cruel for the sake of it? Rowan nodded slowly. Yes, context matters. But who decides what context is acceptable? Who gets to be the arbiter of what counts as thoughtful satire versus cruelty? Because right now, it seems like anyone with a Twitter account and an axe to grind gets to make that call. Marcus shook his head. That is reductive. There are genuine conversations happening about representation, about who gets to tell which stories, about whose pain gets turned into entertainment. Rowan's patience was clearly wearing thin, and those conversations have become suffocating. Every creative decision is now filtered through 1,000 hypothetical objections. Will this offend someone? Will this be misinterpreted? Will this end my career? That is not an environment where good comedy can thrive. That is an environment of fear. Simone leaned in. Maybe a little fear is not a bad thing. Maybe it makes people think twice before they say something harmful. Rowan's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. Or maybe it makes them stop saying anything at all. Maybe it turns comedy into bland, inoffensive pablum that challenges nothing and means nothing. Is that what you want? A world where every joke has been focus grouped and sanitized to the point of irrelevance. Jenna held up her hands. Okay, I feel like we are getting heated here. Let us take a breath and maybe approach this from a different angle. Rowan turned to her. What angle would that be, Jenna? The angle where I pretend to agree that comedy needs to be reformed? The angle where I nod along while you all lecture me about sensitivity and inclusivity, as if those are the primary virtues of art? Marcus bristled. Nobody is lecturing you. We are having a discussion. Rowan laughed bitterly. This is not a discussion. This is an interrogation. You invited me here to talk about comedy, and instead I am being asked to justify my entire approach to my craft, to defend the very idea that comedy should be free to explore uncomfortable territory. Simone's voice rose. You are the one who made this confrontational. We asked reasonable questions about how comedy intersects with social responsibility, and you have been dismissive and defensive from the start. Rowan stood up slightly in his chair. Dismissive? I have been trying to explain a fundamental principle of artistic freedom, and you three have been tag-teaming me with every fashionable talking point about offense and harm and accountability. Do you even hear yourselves? Jenna's voice took on a more serious tone. Rowan, I understand you feel strongly about this, but I think you are mischaracterizing what we are trying to discuss here. Nobody is attacking your work or your legacy. We are simply asking about your thoughts on how comedy exists in a modern context. Rowan sat back down, but his posture remained tense. Modern context. What does that even mean? Comedy has always existed in its contemporary context. Chaplin dealt with his critics. Lenny Bruce dealt with his. Every generation of comedians has faced people telling them what they can and cannot say. The difference now is that those people have been given a megaphone and institutional power. Marcus interjected. Institutional power? You are one of the most successful comedians in the world. You have platforms, you have influence, you have resources. Talking about institutional power when you are sitting at the top seems a bit rich. Rowan's eyes flashed. Success does not equal power over the culture. I may have had a successful career, but that does not mean I control the discourse around comedy. In fact, people like me are constantly being told that our time is up, that we represent an old guard that needs to step aside, that our perspectives are outdated. Simone crossed her arms. Maybe because those perspectives are outdated. The world has changed. The audience has changed. What was acceptable 30 years ago is not acceptable now, and that is a good thing. Rowan leaned forward again. Acceptable to whom? To you? To a vocal minority on social media? To activists who have decided they speak for entire communities? The arrogance of assuming you know what is best for comedy, what is best for audiences, what is best for culture, is staggering. Jenna tried to interject. I do not think anyone here is claiming to know what is best for everyone. Rowan cut her off. Then stop speaking as if you do. Stop framing this conversation as if there is a correct position, and I am on the wrong side of it. You keep talking about evolution and progress as if the direction you are advocating for is inevitable and righteous. But it is not. It is just one perspective, and frankly, it is a perspective that is suffocating creativity. Marcus shook his head. That is your opinion. But there are plenty of comedians who are thriving right now by being thoughtful about their material, By listening to criticism, by adapting. Rowan's voice dripped with sarcasm. Thriving or surviving? There is a difference between success that comes from genuine artistic merit and success that comes from saying the right things, from performing the right politics, from being a good soldier in the culture war. Simone looked appalled. So anyone who disagrees with you is just performing? That is incredibly patronizing. Rowan did not back down. I am saying that there is enormous pressure to conform to a particular worldview right now, and anyone who resists that pressure is painted as problematic or out of touch. That is not healthy for art. That is not healthy for society. Jenna's voice grew firmer. But you are acting as if criticism itself is the problem. People have always critiqued art. That is part of the process. Why is it different now? Rowan pointed a finger. Because criticism used to be about the quality of the work. Now it is about the moral character of the artist. It is not enough for something to be unfunny. It has to be deemed harmful. It is not enough to dislike a joke. You have to argue that it should not have been told at all. That is censorship dressed up as social consciousness. Marcus leaned back. Nobody is censoring you. You still have your career. You still get to make your work. Rowan laughed harshly. Not yet, perhaps, but the mechanisms are in place. Social media pile-ons, advertiser boycotts, network executives terrified of controversy. You do not need government censorship when you have created a culture where stepping out of line means professional destruction. Simone shook her head. That is such a victim mentality. You are not being persecuted. You are being asked to consider other people's feelings and experiences. Rowan's composure cracked further. Victim mentality? I am not claiming to be a victim. I am trying to defend a principle. The principle that comedy should be free to explore, to provoke, to challenge, and yes, to offend. Because offense is not harm, and we need to stop pretending it is. Jenna raised her voice slightly. But when you say offense is not harm, you are dismissing the real psychological impact that words can have on people. There is research showing that certain types of rhetoric can contribute to hostile environments, to discrimination, to violence. Rowan stood up from his chair. Research? What research? Correlation studies that show nothing about causation? Surveys about feelings? That is not evidence. That is ammunition for people who want to control speech. And I am sorry, but I refuse to accept that a joke, a silly, stupid joke, is responsible for violence or discrimination. That is giving comedy far too much power and far too much blame. Marcus stood as well. You keep reducing this to jokes versus censorship, but it is more nuanced than that. It is about who gets hurt, who gets marginalized, who gets silenced by the dominant culture. Rowan's voice rose. And I keep saying that the solution to bad speech is more speech, not less. If you think a joke is harmful, make a better joke. If you think a perspective is wrong, argue against it. But do not try to shut it down. Do not try to make it unsayable. Simone stood up too, her voice shaking slightly. You talk about freedom of speech like it is absolute, but it has never been absolute. There have always been limits, always been consequences. Rowan looked at all three of them standing. Yes, there have been consequences. But those consequences used to come after you said something, not before. Now people self-censor because they are terrified of what might happen. That is not freedom, that is fear. Jenna stepped closer. Rowan, I really think you are misunderstanding what we are trying to say. Rowan held up a hand. No, Jenna, I understand perfectly. You think comedy needs to be tamed, domesticated, made safe. You think the way forward is to make sure nobody feels uncomfortable, nobody feels targeted, nobody feels offended. But that is not comedy. That is public relations. Marcus moved toward him. That is not fair. We are not saying comedy should be safe. We are saying it should be responsible. Rowan's voice was ice cold now. And I am saying that responsibility is subjective, and that you do not get to define it for me or anyone else. Simone's frustration was evident in her voice. You keep talking about subjectivity, but there are objective harms. There are communities that have been historically marginalized, stereotyped, dehumanized. When comedy reinforces those patterns, it contributes to real-world inequality. Rowan turned to face her fully. And when comedy challenges those patterns, When it mocks the powerful, when it exposes hypocrisy, it contributes to progress. But you cannot have one without risking the other. You cannot have sharp comedy without the possibility that someone will get cut. That is the trade-off, and it is worth it. Marcus stepped between them slightly. The trade-off is only worth it if you are not the one getting cut. If you are not the one whose pain is being turned into entertainment. Rowan's jaw clenched. Everyone gets cut by comedy eventually. That is the point. No one is above mockery. No one is too sacred to be satirized. The moment we create protected categories, we create inequality. Jenna raised her hands. But some people have been mocked for centuries. Some people have been the punchline their entire lives. Maybe they deserve a break. Rowan shook his head vehemently. Comedy does not give breaks. Comedy does not play favorites. And the idea that we should redistribute mockery like it is some kind of social resource is absurd. Funny is funny. That is the only standard that matters. Simone's voice cracked slightly. Funny to whom? Because what is funny to you might be devastating to someone else. And if you cannot see that, if you cannot understand that, then maybe you are exactly the problem people are talking about. Rowan took a step back, his face hardening. So now I am the problem, not the people trying to police language, not the activists demanding compliance, not the networks canceling shows over manufactured outrage. I am the problem because I believe comedy should be free. Marcus pointed at him. You keep saying free, but freedom without responsibility is just license to harm. And yes, jokes can harm. They can reinforce stereotypes that lead to discrimination. They can normalize attitudes that lead to violence. Pretending otherwise is willfully ignorant. Rowan's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. I have spent my entire career making people laugh. I have brought joy to millions. I have never advocated for discrimination or violence. But according to you three, I am somehow complicit in these things because I refuse to accept your framework, your rules, your vision of what comedy should be. Jenna tried once more. Rowan, please, we are not saying you personally have done anything wrong. We are just talking about broader trends in comedy. Rowan cut her off sharply. Yes, you are. You have been saying it this entire conversation. Every question has been loaded with the assumption that I need to answer for comedy's sins, that I need to justify my work, that I need to prove I am not a bigot. This was never a conversation. This was a trial. Simone crossed her arms tightly. If you feel like you are on trial, maybe that is because you know deep down that some of what we are saying has merit. Maybe your defensiveness is telling. Rowan's eyes blazed. My defensiveness? You ambush me with political questions disguised as career talk. You gang up on me with rehearsed talking points. You dismiss everything I say as outdated or harmful, and then you have the audacity to psychoanalyze my reactions? Marcus stepped forward. Nobody ambushed you. These are legitimate questions about how comedy intersects with social justice. If you cannot handle that conversation, that says more about you than it does about us. Rowan looked at each of them in turn. Social justice. There it is. The phrase that ends all debate. The trump card that means anyone who disagrees is on the wrong side of history. Well, let me tell you something about history. Every authoritarian movement, every attempt to control thought and speech, has justified itself with noble-sounding rhetoric. And every time, artists and comedians have been among the first targets. Jenna's voice rose. Comparing us to authoritarians is completely out of line. We are trying to have a conversation about empathy and inclusion. Rowan grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. Empathy and inclusion enforced through social pressure and career destruction. Do you hear yourselves? You have created an environment where one wrong word, one joke that lands poorly, one opinion that deviates from the script, can end someone. And you call that progress. Simone moved toward him. You are being dramatic. People are just asking for basic respect. Rowan put on his jacket. Respect goes both ways. I came here expecting a professional interview about my work. Instead, I got a lecture on everything that is supposedly wrong with comedy, and by extension, everything wrong with me. I do not need this. Marcus blocked his path slightly. So you are just going to leave? Walk away when the conversation gets uncomfortable? Rowan met his eyes. No, I am leaving because this stopped being a conversation the moment you all decided I was the enemy. You do not want dialogue. You want confession and capitulation. And I will not give you either. Jenna reached out. Rowan, please do not go. We can reset. We can talk about something else. Rowan shook his head. There is nothing else to talk about. You have made your positions clear. You think comedy needs to be controlled, sanitized, made subservient to political goals. I think comedy needs to be free, wild, dangerous even. We are never going to agree, so there is no point continuing this charade. Simone's voice was sharp. Running away does not make you right. It just makes you a coward. Rowan stopped and turned back to her. A coward? I have spent decades defending the right to offend, the right to push boundaries, the right to make people uncomfortable. I have faced criticism and controversy and calls for boycotts. But I have never backed down, and I have never apologized for making people laugh. So do not you dare call me a coward because I refuse to participate in your show trial. Marcus stepped forward again. This is not a show trial. This is just people asking you to think about the impact of your words. Rowan's voice was steel. I have thought about it. For decades. And I have concluded that the impact of restricting comedy is far worse than the impact of any individual joke. You want me to trade freedom for safety, but I will not do it. And neither should anyone else who cares about art. Jenna made one last attempt. Rowan, please, we value your perspective. We really do. Can we just take a moment and breathe? Rowan looked at her sadly. You do not value my perspective, Jenna. You tolerate it at best. And only because I am famous enough that you have to. But everything about this conversation has been designed to make me look like a relic, like someone who just does not get it. Well, maybe I do not get it. Or maybe I get it perfectly, and I simply reject it. He walked toward the edge of the set. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud or gasp. The three hosts stood frozen, looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to vindication to regret. Rowan paused at the edge one more time and turned back. You asked me how comedy has changed. Here is your answer. It has become afraid. Afraid of offense, afraid of controversy, afraid of being comedy. And until that changes, until we remember that laughter is worth the risk, we will keep producing safe, forgettable nonsense that challenges nothing and means nothing. Good luck with your show. And with that, he walked off the set, leaving the three hosts standing in silence as the cameras continued to roll. So what do you think about how this all went down? Did Rowan have a point about artistic freedom, or were the hosts right to push back on his views? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you do not miss any more stories like this. What do you think is more important in comedy? Complete freedom of expression or social responsibility? Let us know.